we're only going to do Pillar 4 tonight. I found that is more than enough for us, and then we're going to hammer through next week the last 3, which kind of, they can be, a couple of them can be grouped together. There'll be dignity of work and the rights of the workers, solidarity, and care for God's creation. Especially solidarity has a lot of overlap with some of the things that we've talked about already. So, let's roll, huh? So, I'm going to do a quick review in case folks haven't been here, but we'll kind of go through that quickly. So the Church's Catholic social teaching, right, is comprised of the body of doctrine, which flows from the Church's looking at the world through the eyes of Christ and through the eyes of tradition, through the eyes of Scripture, and with the light of the Spirit. And so the social teaching consists of documents mainly from the popes, but also through various bishops' conferences. So we've looked at Pillar 1, the life and dignity of the human person. The foundation of all of this is that each person is made in the image and likeness of God. Each person has dignity simply because they exist. And each of us, each human person, not just the Catholic, not just the Christian, every person is called to promote and defend the dignity of the human person at every stage of life, from conception to natural death. Pillar 2, we looked at last time, called the family, community, and participation. We looked at the fact that God is love, has been revealed to us as God is love. God exists in a community of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and we're made in God's image and likeness. So those three things lead us to the conclusion that we are to be people of communion and we are to be people of love. We talked about Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council, that the well-being of the person and Christian society is intimately linked with the healthy condition produced by marriage and family. That is the goal. Thus, the family is the foundation of society, it's the foundation of the church, and the duty of the human family, the duty of the couple is to promote and to make present Christ's love for his bride, the church, right? And the duty of the Christian family is to manifest Christ's presence in the world. Okay, so this is a quick review. And then Christians are called to promote the values of marriage and family life by what they do, how they live their lives, and in cooperation with other folks. This got us into talking about participation, that we have a duty, because this is our common home. All of us are brothers and sisters of God, or of Christ. We have a responsibility in the politics of life. We must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice. We need to be engaged. So we need to participate and contribute to the greater justice and peace for all people. That's our goal. And the church has an obligation to speak. I mentioned last time that sometimes I get phone calls or emails or unsigned letters saying, hey, stay out of politics, Father. Just stick to the gospel, to which I respond. This is the gospel, to pay attention to the social events of our day and to bring the gospel to it. So we need, as Catholics, as people of faith and of reason, it's necessary for us to bring our faith and reason to the public square, to try to develop the common good and to make sure that folks are being taken care of. And so our duty, it's a moral obligation to participate in the life of society. Okay, then last week we looked at rights and responsibilities, right? And we mainly looked at Pacem in Terris, the document from John the 23rd, back in 1963, shortly before his death. we're each of us is a person, right? We have intelligence, we have free will, and with all of that comes rights and duties, and all of these must be respected. They're not given to us by the government. They are given to us by God, by the nature of the human person. The fact that we have been redeemed by Christ elevates the human person to an even higher level, because we are heirs to Christ, with Christ, to eternal glory. Okay, so we're just by our nature we have these rights and responsibilities, but the fact that Christ has saved us elevates our importance as human beings. And this is for everybody, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not. So we went over these rights. He has a right to be respected, a right to his good name, a right to the truth, a right to speech and publication, a right to pursue whatever kind of work he or she wants. We all have a right to be informed honestly about public events. The right to share in the culture, good education, technical training, if that's our goal. We have the right to worship God according to our conscience and to practice and profess our religion both in private and in the public square. We have the right to choose our state in life, to be married, to be single, to seek religious life. We have economic rights to find the work that we want and to share in the work. Okay, so that's the work part of it. There's a right to private property. We have the right to, but we recognize that owning private property also has a social responsibility obligation as well. We have the right to form unions, form associations to get what we want, what improves the common good. We have the right to emigrate and immigrate based on social conditions and economics, politics. And then, like I said, we have a right to be involved in public life, right? To work with each other to improve the common good. But with our rights, we have, and these rights must be protected in law, but we also have duties. And so with every right comes an obligation. So the right to life means we have a duty to protect it. A right to a decent standard of living means we need a duty to live in a becoming fashion. The right to be free, to seek out the truth. We have to search it out as well. Okay, and we should work together to do all this. All right, that was a speedy, hopefully, for those of you who weren't here, you can watch the video. They're both posted now on the website. Okay? That was a speedy version. Okay, tonight, option for the poor and the vulnerable.
Before we understand Jesus' preferential option for the poor, we have to understand God's preferential option for the poor. God incarnates himself as Jesus among a poor family in a poor village, and Jesus himself preaches among the poor and preaches about the poor.
This is how God is. He is a God who had a special love for those who had no one to turn to. Not because they're righteous, not because they're the most holy and most saintly, but because they are in need, and God comes to their rescue.
In Matthew 25, Christ tells us, "Whatsoever you do for the least of my brothers and sisters, you do unto me." And it's such a beautiful reminder for us that the people we serve who are in poverty, who are in need, are in fact the face of Christ, and because of that have so much to teach us.
So when we go to encounter the poor, let us encounter them as a fellow poor person. Not from a perspective of superiority where they're in the dark, I'm in the light, all of these things. No, I grow in my own humanity when I encounter the person of the poor.
Who are the poor in our society? The poor are those people who are really, really marginalized amongst us, the most vulnerable, those who are forgotten in society.
Here in America, I don't think anyone can say, well, I do not know what's happening in those other parts of the world. But it's not enough to know. We should allow what we see, what we hear and know really touch us. And for us to have that mindset, I may be an American, the person who just lost his whole family is from Syria. But at this point of suffering, we are one.
The preferential option for the poor calls us to address both immediate needs and systemic problems, to look both at the person in front of us and to give them what they need in that moment, but also to say, why is this person in this place? What has happened in our society? What are the larger issues at work, and how can we address those larger issues?
When we see the situations to which the poor are subjected, dehumanizing, humiliating, you could say that those situations manifest the lack of love. Lack of love from other people, lack of love from society, for they did not choose to be poor. They are made poor by others and by systems and structures in society.
In our political lives, in our economic lives, in our social lives, whatever we do, we should always put the poor first.
People try to make caring for the poor out to be something very difficult or complicated or hard to understand. It's not. It basically means a few things. First of all, being charitable to the poor, giving to organizations that care for the poor, giving directly to the poor. It means loving the poor as our brothers and sisters. It means coming to know them, touching them, holding them, shaking their hands, and really physically coming in contact with them, because otherwise, how would we show our love?
What a shame if a community claims to be the bearer of the good news, for that community not to live it, not to embody it. No? And so we ask the question, if the church will not do it, then who else will?
So again, all the social teachings of the church flow from the scriptures, right? And so here, Exodus, the Egyptians are leaving slavery the Israelites are leaving slavery in Egypt, and they come into the promised land, and they're told this: you shall not oppress or afflict a resident alien, not wrong any widow or orphan. They're going to cry out to me if you do, and surely I will listen. So we're going to hear this theme throughout the Old Scripture, the Old Testament, that God hears the cry of the poor. Right? We see that in the books of the prophets. We see that in the Psalms, that the Lord God has a special concern and a special ear in this case for the poor. Here's one we've seen before from Jeremiah, the prophets, right? Do what is right and just, rescue the victims, do no wrong. Again, these are the most vulnerable people, some of the most vulnerable people in the Old Testament: the alien, the orphan, and the widow. The Israelites are called to have special concern for these most vulnerable people. Then, of course, in the Gospels, we have the 25th chapter of Matthew. However you treat one of these little ones, or the least among you, that's how we treat Christ, and that's how we will be judged. So this is not just an extra to the Christian faith. This is at the heart of who we are and what we're called to be, and how we will be judged by God. How did we care for the poor and the vulnerable? Okay, so Rerum Novarum we talked about last time. This is the first, what we would call the social doctrine encyclicals, the first one of social justice. It's on the condition of labor, so we'll come back to this when we look at the rights of the workers and the rights of the dignity of work. But here, Leo XIII talks a lot about, remember this is coming out of the Industrial Revolution, people moving from the agrarian to the cities, and unsafe conditions, long hours, there's no unions, there's no Bill of Rights for the worker. Kids are working, moms and dads are both working to make a living. So Leo XIII takes this opportunity to write about this, about how we respect the rights and duties of the wealthy and the poor, of capital and of labor. So a lot of this document is about workers, that they need to be respected and treated fairly, but it also goes into the family and how we satisfy how work cannot get in the way of our practice of religion. So Leo says, justice demands that the interests of the poor population be carefully watched over by the administration, meaning the government, so that they who contribute, the poor who contribute largely to the advantage of the community, may themselves share in the benefits they create. So the problem was these folks were working like dogs, getting very little, right? And the owners were getting rich and not sharing with the workers, not giving them health care, any time off. Sundays were working, people were working long hours. So the Pope said it's good for the state to secure from misery those on whom it so largely depends, right? Some of this stuff is going to say, hey, that sounds like it could have been written today, right? We see people who run companies making, it used to be pretty close, 3, 4, 5 times what the workers made. Now it's exponentially higher in some of these companies. So Rerum Novarum kind of begins the social tradition of the church through papal writings. Then there's a couple of popes who write about it. And then one of the most important documents in this area is by Pope Paul VI. We'll see that in the future, John Paul will quote him because he's the next pope. John Paul will cite this work. Then Benedict will cite it. And then now Francis comes back to this document of Pope Paul VI in 1967. So again, people say, well, if the church would just stay out of work and business and all that stuff, just mind its own P's and Q's. But Pope Paul says, look this is of great concern to the church because these are the church's sons and daughters, right? So we need to make sure that we're caring for all of those, but with a special attention to those who are hungry and poor and sick. They want a larger share in the role of the community, and so Paul says that's why I'm undertaking this work, and he'll cite Rerum Novarum moving forward. So Paul is looking both at the individual person, but he's also looking at those poorer nations. So think of 1967, right? The situation in the world in 1967. A lot of it is East versus West, right? Russia versus the United States in the Cold War. Sometimes the popes will talk about it. It's a division between North and South. The people above the northern part of the equator, they're doing okay. The people south, they're not seeing the benefits of the growth in society. So, remember we talked about in Genesis, way back in Genesis, Cain kills Abel, and God comes to him and says, where's your brother? Right? And Cain says, what? And say, I just whacked him, right? I just killed him. He says, my brother's keeper. And we started there on the first week and says, yes, this is the social doctrine of the church. right? We are our brother's keepers. We are to care for one another. And so when the poor cry out, all of us should hear our brother, our sister's plea, and answer it with great love. So yes, we are our brother's, our sister's keeper. So Paul reflects on this and says, the church has been at this, the people business now for 1900 years. So we know what it's about. And our goal here is to seek on continue the work of Christ through the Spirit. What did Christ come to do? He gave witness to the truth, to save, not to judge, to serve, and not to be served. And who did he have the great affection for? It was the poor. Here, we're going to get into this over all the popes, because there was an argument that we should see development in economic terms only. So if you were rich, well, you've been developed. And if you're poor, you're kind of undeveloped. But Paul starts to say, no, this is not just about economics. It needs to take care of the entire person, right? We want this, what he calls this full-bodied humanism, right, which is the fulfillment of the human being. So it's John Paul will pick up on this, as we'll see. This is what to be well-rounded. That's what it means to be developed. That's what it means to be human. And so we need to be attentive to all areas of life, not just economics, as we're talking the development of the human person. Okay. All right. Okay, so now he's seeing this connection. He's coming to the West and to the wealthier nations, right? And he points out these three obligations on us. We have to have solidarity, right? The rich nations just can't stay off by themselves and say, hey, like we said last week, too bad you weren't born in the United States. No, we have to have a mutual solidarity with the developing nations. He wants to look at trade relations between the strong and the weak. He saw that the richer nations, the developed nations, were taking advantage of poorer nations. And then this idea of universal charity. We have to look broader than our borders. We have to look at a more humane world community where all people can flourish. Stop if I'm just going to. There's lots to say, and this idea continues to be developed as the popes move 20 years, and they say, okay, where are we at? That's what Pope John Paul will do. So again, think of the mid-60s, society is sorely ill. Right? The weakening of this tie that we have as sons and daughters of the living God, right? So we have this breakdown in relationships between people and between nations. So, here Pope Paul makes a point that all the popes will make. When we fight injustice, when we fight poverty, we're not only promoting human being, the well-being of the person, but this is their financial condition. This is their spiritual and moral development, right? And this goes to the benefit of the whole human race, and it also benefits us. There's a great story, I don't know how true it is, but if it isn't, it should be. Cardinal George from Chicago was speaking to a great collection of people that he was asking them for money. And he goes, the poor need you to meet their needs, right? Housing, food, things like that. Then he says, you need the poor to stay out of hell. Great line. And if it's not true, it should be. All right? Right? The poor need us to lift them up and to help them as much as we can and as much as they need. Obviously, they have obligation to take it up. But we need the poor to remind us of our call to be Christ, right? To be attentive to those in our midst who are poor and in need. It has to lift up our spirit of charity, right? So he didn't say it quite like that, but I like the way that Cardinal George is said to have said it. Right? This is builds up not only the poor, it builds us up, right? That might have been Cardinal George calling me. He's dead. So that'd be a very interesting phone call. Okay.
Calling.
Yes. So here, Pope Paul calls on Catholics and Christians, really anyone of goodwill, to take on Christ's injunction, seek and you shall find, right? We need to cooperate among each other, greater charity, develop greater communion between our brothers and sisters, and this is the desire to build peace and mutual harmony. I think the line before this, he said, peace is not simply the absence of war, right? It's a perfect form of justice among men. So if you want peace, the sign goes, fight for justice. Okay, so that's Paul the 60s, 67. So 20 years later, John Paul intentionally fixed that year because as you can see, that Populum Progressio, that was Pope Paul's letter, that was the Latin for it. He says they retain all the stuff, the force that he talked about 20 years ago. And so John Paul says, I need to look at the situation today and expand on that. Because he says the situation today is no less dramatic than it was 20 years ago. So think of the mid-60s now, think of the mid-80s, 87. What's happened? The wall has not come down, right? We got a few more years, right? 90 something. So he'll still talk about this fight between East and West, right? So John Paul is relying on Pope Paul's, his predecessor, and we'll look at it with new eyes. Far from being realized what Paul had hoped for. These are some of the things he worries about: production, distribution of food, hygiene, health and housing, availability of drinking water, working conditions, especially for women, life expectancy. Disappointing, he says. Disappointing. The word gap returns spontaneously to mind. There's a big gap between the haves and the have-nots, and it's growing. And the gap means not just economically, but opportunities, things like that. Here's some of the things he points to: illiteracy, difficulty of obtaining higher education. You know, seeing Mary here, in Haiti, you know, we have made a big push to get kids educated at the earlier ages. But what we've discovered, right, is that how important it is for the kids then to go on to high school and to college. And so that's where folks are starting to see more bang for their buck. Obviously, it's a little bit more expensive, but the folks that have the gifts to go on to high school and college, that's where there's more need. And so that's, I know Reiser's been helping out with that. We've done a little bit, but not as much as them. But that's, because a lot of folks will go to the elementary schools, right? But then the expense of going on to college that's where the expense starts to pick up and people just can't do it, families can't do it. So this idea of obtaining higher education, very, very important. Again, the ability to work in politics, to be involved in politics, not just to vote, right, but to go lobby and advocate for positions. We see political and religious oppression. We see that today. So all those things, John Paul saw 1987. So it's now 30 years. Bless you. Some points he said: the housing crisis. Millions of people lacking adequate housing, no housing at all, underemployment, unemployment. A lot of talk back then was about the huge debts that these poor nations had. They can never get out of debt. He saw the arms production as a very serious disorder, not just economic. It was taking money away that could be used for the poor, but also was a spiritual and a moral issue. I think he would think the same today. So, see here he's talking about this fight between the East and the West that's caused a stagnation to the south, south of the border, or south of the equator. Here's the big thing that he talked about. The West, as it grows richer, turns away from the poor. This growing in selfish isolation. You guys deal with your own problems. And the East, the problem is they suppress some of the rights that are important to the human person. Then we have both the East and the West turning away from the expectation of the human person. It's a real moral obligation. So here's some language that John Paul uses that I've noticed Francis picking up on. This consumerism that we can just go out and we just throw stuff away, right, and go out and buy something new, right? So this idea of consumption or consumerism, which involves so much throwing away and waste. Of course, Francis will use this language about the human person, right? We have we just throw people away. The poor, the marginalized, we have a tendency to not see them and leave them to their own devices. It's a throwaway culture. It's one of indifference. Pope Francis uses a lot. So we have this underdevelopment at his time of the South, and then we have this super development in the West, right? And both of them are bad, right? Because neither one of them leads to happiness, true happiness, right? The people to the North were so consumed with stuff, and the people to the South, they don't have the stuff to be happy. So both are miss the mark. So he goes back to Genesis and says, you know what? We're social animals. We talked about this the first night. We're social animals. And we're supposed to work out our stuff together, right? God put us in this garden to control it, right? To have dominion over it. But we have to do this together. And it's not, where does he say it? But we're still subject to God's will, right? We're not supposed to trash the environment. We're supposed to use it because we're stewards of it. And we have to pass it on to the next generation. So we're the as Pope Francis says, we're the crown jewel of creation. We do have superiority. We have dominion over over the rest of creatures, but we're still subject to what God asks of us and commands us, and we have to respect that. So we have this affinity not just with each other, but with God, whose image and likeness we are created in. So, yes, it's great to develop, and it's great to come up with new ideas and to expand. We always have to do that with the common good in mind and our affinity, our relationship with God. So, again, this is both individuals. I think he's pointing to both individuals and to nations. So here he is. He's saying we can't just do this individually, right? And we just don't do this, again, as a person individually and as a nation. Just not one nation does this. All of us, every man and woman, society and nation, especially the church and other faith communities, we have to work together to develop the whole person. That's a duty that we owe towards ourselves. It's a duty we owe towards every person. Right? Of course, these are huge goals, and these are, a huge. We've got over 7 billion people in the world. About 2 billion of them are Catholic or Christian. 1 billion of them are Catholic, right? So he's speaking to a world, right? He's talking to people of goodwill, saying all of us should be doing this, but not everybody has this understanding of the human person, right? Even though it comes to us through nature, we don't need to know. We don't need to have God tell us that all of us are created equally. God affirms that, but not everybody accepts that. So here again, the promotion, the development of the human person, the option for the poor and the vulnerable. We're not just saying we got to give them more stuff, right? We also have to recognize their dignity as human beings, that they can participate in the economy and in the politics of the day. That's what it means to be human, right? To be engaged in the social activity, the culture of the day. That's what it means to be a human person. Okay? So we're getting to the end of John Paul, and he says, this is what it means to evangelize. We use our social doctrine, right? It's a part of the church's evangelizing mission. So we go out to the world and say, okay, we believe in Jesus Christ, that he lived and died and rose from the dead. That's one part. That's the charisma. That's the basic of the Christian message. Okay? What does that mean? What does that mean, that Jesus suffered and died and rose from the dead? What does it mean to you? Well, it means that I take on the social doctrine, right? I treat one another as Christ has loved me. I have a special care option for the poor and the vulnerable. That's what it means, right? And if we're not doing that, then people just look at us and go, really? You don't sound like much of a Christian to me, right? If we're not doing these things. So John Paul says, this is what it means. Our social doctrine message includes and has come to take on this preference for the poor, this love for the poor, right? To take on the hungry, the needy, the homeless, those without medical care, all without a hope or a better future. Right? We cannot forego that. Otherwise, we end up being like the rich man who steps over Lazarus lying at his door. We just had that gospel, right? We have to be attentive to these people, our brothers and sisters, because Christ says that's where you're going to find me, right? And so if we ignore those people, we ignore their plight, the poor and the vulnerable, well, then we're ignoring Christ himself. All right, so that's John Paul. So then we move, not quite, let's see, 22 years. Benedict comes in with charity in truth, right? Caritas in veritas. Caritas in veritas. Charity and truth go together. Right? Charity and truth go together. This is the driving force behind the development of every person and of all humanity. So this is a little nuanced. Again, he'll come back to Pope Paul VI's document. Again, he's taken it up in a new way. But he uses some new language, or at least he's approaching it from a different angle. He says this is all about charity and truth. Right? Charity is at the heart of the church's social doctrine. Everything that we do reflects the teaching of Christ, and that was driven by love, which is the synthesis or the totality of the law. So social doctrine, the development of the human person, option for the poor and vulnerable, it's all got truth and charity, according to Benedict. Okay, so here he finds encouragement. On the one hand, you say, apart from me, you can't do anything on your own, right? But he also says, I'm with you always. Right? This is not our job alone. This is really Christ's work, and we are participating in it. He gives us the grace. He gives us the privilege of doing this work with him. Yesterday, we celebrated the feast of St. Teresa of Avila, and her motto, Christ has no hands or feet but yours, right, in the world. Right, we have this privilege of participating in the work of Christ, who promises to be with us and to sustain us in that work. I love this line. Development, taking care or lifting up the poor and the vulnerable, it needs Christians with their arms raised towards God in prayer. Right? I think he would say we also need maybe Benedict would say this, we need to be praying. Francis would be saying, you need to get the smell of the sheep on you. Right? You need to get your hands dirty. Right? We need to work knowing that this is to be charitable, knowing that that's the truth. The truth is we need to honor one another by caring for them. That's how we really develop the development of the whole person. So we need to turn to God. This is God's work. We're partners with God. So that leads us, Benedict had a lot to say on that. But then just a few years later, 4 years later, after Benedict, Pope Francis comes out with the Joy of the Gospel. And many of you have studied this already, so I'm just going to hit some highlights. So he starts by saying, there's been progress made. We can't be doom and gloom people. There's been progress. But he also says we also have to remember that a lot of folks, he says a majority of our contemporaries, live day to day. The spread of disease, the hearts of people gripped by fear and desperation. And this is not just a developing country issue, right? How often are people in our country living day to day, paycheck to paycheck? When we're focusing on feeding ourselves and feeding our family, it's hard to sometimes think about the future, think about God. People are very vulnerable at these moments. Here's where Pope Benedict or Pope Francis is picking up on some of the language of John Paul, where we've created this throwaway culture, where we're excluding people from society. So it's not just stuff that we're throwing away. This microwave, I can fix it, but it's down at the rummage sale. right? It's down at the rummage sale now. I'll go get a new one. It's only $100. Francis says now this is growing to people, right? They're getting old. Let's put them out. Let's lay them down like a dog. Let's take them out of their misery. We're not caring for our elderly the way we should. We're killing the unborn. We're selective in who is born. This is a reflection of this throwaway culture, which is, if it's not perfect, we don't want any part of it. Right? So, so here again, he says every Christian, every church needs to be this instrument of God for the liberation and promotion of the poor. Again, not just to meet their financial needs, their economic needs, but that they can be a full part of society, right? That they can vote, that they can be seen as someone who has needs beyond economic needs that need to be addressed. So he calls on us to be docile, docile, open, and attentive to the cry of the poor, and to come to their aid. Again, it's something from the Old Testament that obviously runs through the New Testament, that God has a special place for the poor. So much so that he became poor in the person of Jesus. It was interesting reading reading this document today, where Pope Francis says, if you think you can be Christian and run your community without caring for the poor, you're wrong, right? You're wrong, because then you camouflage it. He says this spiritual worldliness with mass and religious practices. You're empty in what you're doing. Then in the next, I don't think I did 208. So that was 207, 208. 208, he goes, I apologize if you think I'm speaking harshly at you, but I am, right? I am. So we have to, again, we have to be Christ-like. We have to be little Christ to care for the vulnerable just as Christ did. It can't be on success and self-reliance. We have to help the slow, the weak, or the less talented to find opportunities in life. This is what it means to develop the human person. This is what it means to have an option for the poor and to care for the vulnerable. So here he's saying, okay, we've talked about the suffering Christ, the poor, the hungry, the thirsty, but he says there's new people in whom we have to recognize Christ. He talks about the homeless, the addicted, refugees, indigenous peoples, the elderly again, the abandoned. He goes on to talk about those who are being trafficked, the baby in the womb. He gives several other examples as he moves down through the document. But these are new people, or new categories of people, I would say, to whom we encounter Christ when we encounter them. And we must deal with them. And that is number 272, slide 72. So that's the slideshow. What I thought after I finished last week, I thought, you know what, we kind of run through this, and I'd like to take some questions, but I thought it'd be helpful to say, okay, how do we do that here at St. Mary's? We had we're having meetings about being a missionary parish, right? How do we be a missionary parish? How do we do that, what the popes have been telling us to do, how do we do that now? Where do we need to improve? What are the groups maybe that we're not hitting? Because that's where we're trying to move. We're trying to say, look at everything that we do and say, okay, does this really serve the mission, or are we just doing this because we've always done it? Right? What we're looking at is to say, okay, what are we doing now that gets at what all the popes have said, that gets at our option for the poor, the vulnerable, where are we falling short? So first, questions, and then or some ways that we are working together to address some of these things where we have an option for the poor or the vulnerable, where we're trying to develop people, maybe where we're falling short. Go.
I feel like I see success from other parishes in a way that, not the Catholic faith, but in other ones, that they have motivational speakers.
Mm-hmm.
You go there and they make you feel so good. I mean, you talk to people and, they make you feel so good.
Mm-hmm.
And my Catholic feeling is, Jesus died on the cross for us. That didn't feel good. So here you're preaching to people to make them feel good, motivated. Not, I don't know how you'd ever bring the motivation of making you feel good. Like you say, all the worldly things, the feel good, motivation. They have motivational speakers.
Yep.
That are phenomenal.
Yep.
Now, if a priest could be a motivational speaker, which you're very good at in the Christ
I was about to shed a tear.
You're very good in. You're
Yeah.
very good. But I just think that their extremes are like so motivational.
Okay,
to
yep.
make you feel good. It's
Okay.
like so.
So maybe, well, let me see if I got your point, other than I'm not as motivational as some of the other people. No, I'm just kidding.
But the motivation
So here's the deal. Are you suggesting that they're motivating people, they're making people feel good?
Yes.
Is that leading them then to action, or are they just motivating them so that they feel good so they come back?
My point.
Yeah. Okay. So I think based on what the popes have said, if we're motivating people to feel good, then we're masking what we're supposed to be doing with spiritual practices, and our work is empty. I think based on what the popes have said, I would say that's when we had the readings today. Woe to you, scholars of the law! Woe to you, Pharisees! You talk a good game, but you don't walk the walk, right? So they're empty, right? So the goal would be to have motivational people or motivational messages or encouraging messages that drive people to work, to do the things that we're saying, right? Right? Of course, our motivational speaker, our best one, is Jesus himself. He says, meet me in these people. I'm not sure how much, to me that's motivating in the sense of do these things or you're not going to heaven, right? So part of that is how do we make that attractive for people to serve? To see the reality, the connection between what we do at Mass and then what we do out here in the world. That's we need to make that connection, and also that what we do in the world has eternal consequences, right? So yeah, I would agree, and it's not just I think that some of the most motivating people are people who say very little We see them lead very holy lives. They're out there serving.
But that doesn't look like fun.
Doesn't look like fun.
I mean,
Yeah,
like talking about this society and
right.
the way people are, I'm kind of categorizing, but the
Yeah.
younger, the
Well, I think
millennials and the
Yeah, people
the
want
other
to. The young people want to
generations, you
serve.
know, they,
Well, these churches you're talking about, I think it's the music at first that's
Yeah.
really loud.
Yeah.
The sitting and drinking the coffee and socializing.
Yeah.
I think that's what,
Yeah.
maybe the motivation talker.
Yeah.
Well, you had all this before, and you're kind of like, up at it.
Yeah,
And you
yeah.
go, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what it's all about in those
But does
churches.
it move them forward? Does
Right.
it move
That's
them
the
to
question.
do
Yeah.
good?
yes,
Yeah.
we're just right
Sometimes I
now.
think it needs to be
It's a right now.
brought out to all of us that here are the people that really need your help. How are we doing it here? Do you feel responsibility for this? Maybe shaming us a little bit.
It's called Catholic guilt.
Well,
If we were talking about Catholic guilt, then it's not a bad thing
but no.
because it's stoking something in us. It's a truth, right? It's a truth, right? As Benedict would say, it's a truth that we're called to serve one another, right? So that truth that we're digging at, that's making us feel guilty, I think that's God saying, yeah, you really should be.
That's
really
my
should be.
mother.
Yeah, disguised with God's voice.
I would see having motivational speakers from people who actually do these different kinds of work, like somebody working with the homeless, somebody working with the elderly, and share their stories of, of the people and how it's touched them and made them get closer to God. Explain how even though some people are very hard to look at, touch, how this person, the speaker can see Jesus in each person, and how important it is for us to look at the homeless person or whoever as a child of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
A motivational speaker that can help you see that, hear her stories, his stories of their work. That's what I'd like to hear more of anyhow.
Yeah, we've talked about. I mean, we had some people share their faith stories, and people said those are inspiring. These are just folks from our neighbors, and they go, "Oh, that's interesting. I never knew he or she did that." And we were talking about that the other day, about how do we incorporate these faith sharing stories at Mass, either or on the videos through the internet and things like that. That those are inspiring, saying, "Oh, I could do that." And some people, they say, "Well, I can't do those things anymore. Maybe 30 years ago, I would have loved to do that." Right? What can I do now? Well, there's lots of stuff that people can do now. Right?
I think
My prayer warriors.
I think that's the thing. There's lots of stuff.
Right.
But we kind of need to be pointed right there. Here's something that you can do. To have someone speak to us and say, well, wherever they come from,
Yep.
these are things we need and these are things you can do. And this is a group you could become a part of.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we just don't know all these things. We're really good in our hearts. but-
Yeah. I can't wait to hear something that I really like to do, and I'll do it. But then, waiting to hear that
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Father, when society or people give money or food to third world countries, do you think it really gets to where it's supposed to be? Because I heard a missionary on TV one day, and he said in some of these third world countries, there are warehouses that are filled with food that haven't been distributed or money that hasn't been given out. So can you be pretty confident that the right thing happens?
Well, I know that in our work in Haiti, that's one of the reasons why the parish hooked up with Rise of Relief, because they had vetted a lot of these folks that we work with, and I hand the money to them or wire it to them, and so I know where the money is going. I would never send it to the Haitian government, right? And the other thing is, people that we give the money to, we go down and check it out. They know that if they're not using the money the way they said they're going to use it, then that source of money is going to dry up very quickly, right? So, yes, I believe that sending money through some nonprofits, that those things happen where it doesn't get to where it's supposed to get, or a lot of money is spent in advertising or fundraising. But those are the things that you should look, and you can go on the internet and check how much money these people actually gets to their where they say it's going to get. I can confidently say, I know Mary can back me up, because she's on the board at Riser, that the money that we take to Haiti gets to where it's supposed to go. Now that's not saying that every once in a while you have to help things along a little bit, but your money is being well used in Haiti. It's being used responsibly because Sister Evelyn she's tight with the money and likes to run a good deal, and such to the point where I think some of the people in Jeremy, the bigger town, where they see her coming in, they kind of just shake their head because she's going to work them, right? She's going to work them hard to get the best deal. So yes, I think the situation that you said happens. From St. Mary's, the trafficking group, we vet those agencies. So we are, at least here at St. Mary's, we're very aware that the money that you give to us to give to other places is hard-earned money, and we want to make sure that we're good stewards of the money that you entrust to us so that it goes to the right spot. And that is going to be used well. So hopefully all Catholic churches can say that, but I'll only speak for St. Mary's and say yes, that's well used. So how about some successes here at the parish? I see a lot of people from different organizations where we're lifting up some of the people that the popes have talked about. You want to brag about their group?
Well, I see that St. Mary's does a lot for Haiti, for Mar Franc and Sister Evelyn. We see the school being built, the trains being built, money going to feed the nuns, the students, some of the workers. I mean, St. Mary's has done wonderful things in Mar Franc. Without St. Mary's, Mar Franc wouldn't have the school, the latrines. Kids wouldn't have food. So.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in the homily this weekend.
And they're starting another school?
Not another school, another building to the school. So the first one's full of students. Remember, they just started with the smallest ones, and they keep adding a grade every year as the kids get older. But now the report was, I thought there was 172, but they told me it's closer to 200 students are there. The building is probably, they put, 30, 35 kids in a classroom, so maybe more than that. So they need to add a second building.
I think the most important thing you can do is to really be involved with whatever it is that you're giving money to. I think you really have to, or if you're voting or whatever, you really have to be involved, because if you stay on the periphery or you just give money, you don't have any real assurance unless you really know people. Like Haiti, we know where it's going. We know the people that are running it. So I don't think that you have any assurance at all unless you get physically involved in some way with the organization.
Which brings up a good point. I know when my dad, we'd bring in his mail, there'd be hundreds of solicitations, right? They all seem very good. Some of them seem really good. And he wasn't, before we started taking his mail away from him, he was writing checks to these organizations. And of course, they sell their mailing list to somebody else. And we're getting more stuff and phone calls and things like that. We don't have to give to every organization, right? We have as I tell people, you have a set amount of money that you have, a certain percentage of that here at the parish, and then you pick some charities that are special to you, or that you want to support, and you should research those, right? But you're not obligated to give to every person who asks, and you're not obligated to give to every person, even if they send you a nickel with a rosary. Keep the nickel, bring the rosary to church, and give it to somebody. We'll take it to Haiti and keep the nickel. Right? You don't have to give to them just because they gave you a nickel and a calendar and a bunch of labels. Right? Throw that in the trash if you don't support it. Right? But we are, as the popes have said, we are all responsible to doing some things within our means, whether it's financial or time, to develop, to share the development of other people and of the common good.
I think that St. Mary's has a wonderful outreach within the parish and in the White Bear Lake area, surrounding communities, between the Eucharist for the homebound masses and the care center. I think that St. Mary's does a very nice job reaching out to those vulnerable people who need befriending and visits and Eucharist and prayer and support. I just sometimes feel maybe sad that it seems to be the same people sometimes who do it, and that's what I don't know. How do you reach to this wealthy community to get more people to do more of that?
Mm-hmm.
Exodus lending for payday lending issues. How do you get more people writing those letters support? I don't know. That's if you were going to ask me what I did.
Yeah. So we not only have an obligation, and we'll talk about this. I think it was solidarity. We have an obligation to attend to the person in front of us, but we also have an obligation to go after those structures of sin that prevent the development of the human person. Right. So advocacy. Using where we spend our money, right? Where we buy fair trade stuff instead of, places that maybe are made by folks being taken advantage of in other countries, right? So we have an obligation to do the research. In the video they says every purchase that we make, it's a moral choice, right? At the store, it's a moral choice. We don't often think of that. At least I don't when I'm at the grocery store. I just toss stuff in, but you never think of, okay, where did this coffee come from? Who made the coffee? Who picked the beans? How are they getting paid? All those types of questions. So we have, you're right, we have a duty to not only tend to the person in front of us, but also to go after those structures of sin that keep people down. How do you excite people about that? I think if you could figure that out, you would be very, very, very extremely rich. Because we can motivate people, but then we have to get them to do it, right? So again, it's breaking through the hardness of heart and that importance of seeing the other person, or maybe not seeing that person, but just knowing that that person exists, who's being, just raked with 150% interest on their loans.
But I think this right here, Catholic social teaching, right here, 101, is a beginning. And
Right.
I wonder sometimes if those things built on, so we do this, then what do we do next? How do we build on that so
Right.
that people who come here, who hear that, what all those popes laid out for us, Jesus laid out for us, and then the popes.
Yep. So in January we'll start the Just Faith. So that was the whole idea behind. We were going to do Just Faith, which is more of a hands-on. Okay, now that we know what the social teaching is, how do we implement it? Okay. So we were going to do that in the fall, and Samantha and I said, well, before we say how do we implement it, we got to know what the social teaching principles are. So that's why we're doing this 101 session first. to give us a bigger or a better base, a better foundation for what social teaching is. And then in January, we're going to do more of the application of it. How do we do social justice? What does that look like in White Bear? Yeah, so we're promoting this throughout the year, the social justice teaching, because as the popes have said, or other people have said, this is just a great treasure that most people either are not familiar with, willfully or otherwise. They just say. Some people would say, well, this is just politics, right?
I think
The
not
church
familiar.
being involved in politics.
I bet, just not even knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my guess.
Right. So, like you said, we have events like this, and usually the same people show up. It's the same people that are doing the ministry, right? And so part of it is, I would say, it's preaching to the choir, but giving them more foundation. But then again, it's our job to invite someone to come into our ministry. That person will ask, hey, would you ever be interested in helping with this particular item? And if they say no, well, is there something that you're really passionate about? Because we probably have it here at St. Mary's, or we can connect them to it. But yeah, it's easy to write a check and say, okay, I did my work. Again, Pope Francis would say, you got to get your hands dirty, right? Especially in the West.
Well, I
You gotta
think
get your
one
hands
of the
dirty.
things that St. Mary's does so well is that when they do promotions of various types of things like this, they have all of these pockets of places where you can actually put that energy if you want to. I mean, I've never seen such an active parish, and it is true that it's usually the same people all the time, but the one thing you can't do is recruit people and then not have a place where they really feel like they're needed, because there's nothing worse than volunteer and not have people follow up or not feel that your time is necessary, like you really needed.
Right.
And I think St. Mary's does a really good job of that. Of course, how do you get additional people to get enthusiastic about it?
Yeah.
I think you have to personally ask them and take them and get them started.
Mm-hmm.
But most of all, the Be My Witness and all of the thrust toward that, I think, has made this a very welcoming parish. And I think people do feel comfortable in coming in and being accepted. Because White Bear has a reputation for being kind of like, if you haven't lived here 100 years, you're probably some sort of a transient, and you may not last very long. But I just find St. Mary's to be so full of love and enthusiasm. I really think that's the reason it's growing. I mean, we're adding people when many churches are losing people right and left.
Well, you're at the welcome desk, so you're the face of welcome, right? So people just they want what you have.
Well,
right?
I count the deaths and the baptisms too. It's a kind of given.
Yeah. We're +3 this week, by the way. Yeah. Anything else? Anything from our mission person?
You know, one thing that I've heard a few times connected to mission is I mean, there's lots of people talking about the mission of the church and what that means. And recently, some reading around being relational, that it's really about relationships. And that's what we heard today, was that we are our brother's keeper. We are called to be in communion and community with each other. So mission really is about relationships and building them, and everything that we talk about here is related to that. So how do we nurture that? To Romaine's point, how do we be in deeper relationship with each other, and that compels you So that's what we're trying to tackle.
Right. Right.
So keep
So
all
it's
those
this
good
way, right?
ideas coming.
As
Yeah.
I think it was John Paul said,
Yeah.
we have an affinity towards God. We have to be responsible to God, but also that we have this responsibility this way to one another, right? So we have both love of God and love of neighbor, and we show our love of God by the way we love our neighbor, right? They say, how can you love the God you don't see if you don't love the person who's standing right in front of you, right? So, yeah, both of those relationships need to be nurtured.